Reverend.
Hi,
Hey, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you.
I see you got your ball ministry all shining. Come on here. Looking clean and fresh, brother.
I think Michelle logged in as an attendee and not as a panelist.
You want to shoot her a quick text?
Yeah.
Hello.
Probably. Hey, Mom.
Hi, Dr. Simmons.
How you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing pretty good.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yes.
Where are you now?
Oakland, California.
Get out.
Mm-hmm. Town business.
All right. You cut my phone off.
Oh, that part.
Oh yeah. Got to do that part. It rings all the time. Just cut it off. Where is Nichelle?
She's logged in. I need to
Oh,
send.
she's logged in?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll make this happen in a moment. So 1 second. So if you guys, I'll mute you guys.
So you're in Oakland. What church is that? It's an
I
organization.
am at the Way Christian Center with Pastor Michael McBride in Berkeley.
Okay. All right.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, I'm not on staff, but he got me out there preaching.
Okay.
It was so funny because my husband started going there first, going to their men's group. And then when I left my role at Friendship Missionary Baptist Church, I started going just to be there. Like I would sit, and then I had one too many conversations with Pastor Mike. He was like, "Oh, you went to Yale? Oh, you Pentecostal? Oh, I was like, no. Did I say that? I mean, I'm a lay leader, just trying to chill in the back."
I look, I'm doing the same thing. I'm doing the same thing. Trying to stay in the back.
Listen.
Well, I know Oakland well. I spent all of my adult life in San Francisco.
Did you? I didn't know that.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, which churches were you at?
I was licensed and ordained at Third Baptist.
No way.
With Freddie Haynes. Yes. We were like a year apart in ordination. Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
I did not know that.
Yes.
Yeah, Third Street's
First
still
woman
there.
ordained at Third Baptist Church.
What?
Yep.
Oh, come on here.
That was me.
Very cool. So yeah, you've seen San Francisco through some changes.
Lord have mercy, did I? So I'm in Atlanta now, but still got several good friends out in the Bay Area.
Good. Are you out here often or not? Not as much.
Not since my mother died. My mother was out there, and she died 3 years ago. And so that kind of changed things. But
yeah, I'm sure.
My peeps, they love coming to Atlanta.
Yes.
Walk out there, it's like, okay.
Listen, I was just there this weekend. I was supposed to go to Spellhouse Homecoming. I didn't even go to tailgate. I was so busy catching up with folks,
Good.
But Atlanta's good.
Have you found Nichelle?
Yes, I just sent her the link, so she should be coming in really soon.
Okay. So have we gone live nationally?
No, ma'am. I'll tell you in a moment.
Okay. Look like I'm in a dark room. Let me see, can I fix that? Okay.
Hey.
I think that's a little bit.
Looks like we're live.
All right. Is Michelle with us?
I think she's coming in.
There she is.
There we go.
Doctor?
Hi, Dr. Gidger.
Yeah.
Hey,
Ray.
Technical difficulties, y'all. Technical difficulties.
Okay.
Thank you, Willie.
We out here. You made it.
Reverend Francois, we're here.
Yes, ma'am. I'm doing the Facebook Live feed now, and then we're ready to go.
Come here.
Ow.
I'm so excited.
I know. Look at this 21st century Black church. Yes.
I know.
Come on.
All right. So let's do it. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for this important conversation, which is unfortunately a rare conversation in ecclesial spaces, faith-based spaces. But it is again, my name is Willie Francois. I'm the president of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality. And the Black Church Center is the BCC, as we affectionately call it, is a theological think tank and national policy advocacy organization that seeks to reaffirm the social justice traditions of Black churches by providing platforms for progressive theological debate, public policy advocacy, and public engagement. And I want to thank our panelists for joining us today for their work that they do across the world and for what they're going to contribute this evening. I want to thank all of us as we are continuing to populate this town hall that we call the Black Church Agenda. And tonight we're talking about sexual violence and the Black church. Sexual violence is the church has not always been, churches have not always been on the empowering and liberative end of these conversations. In fact, we've done more work to shame violence survivors than we have to empower and to give brave space for survivors. Three panelists today, three thought leaders, three faith leaders, three experts in this subject, and amongst all the other things that they do exceptionally well to share with us tonight. I want to start by offering my regrets that our chair of the board of directors, the Reverend Dr. Delman Coates, our founder, is not able to join us tonight because one of the one of the 7 police officers, I believe that's the correct number, that were murdered in South Carolina, one of which was his cousin, one of whom was his cousin. And so he is in South Carolina with family right now. So we want to keep Dr. Coates and his family in prayer as they wrestle through and continue to reinvest in life after such a hard loss, I can imagine. And just before I introduce our panelists, I want to just take a moment, just pause for a moment to honor the lives that were taken from us on Saturday at the Tree of Life Synagogue at the hands of another white nationalist. And even as we think of those 11 persons whose lives were taken while they were preyed on, while they were praying, I want to also make the connection that the 2 Black persons who died, who were murdered in Kroger in Kentucky, were murdered after that white nationalist could not gain access into a Black church. And so it is necessary for us, as we start this conversation about violence, start with a moment of silence for those 11 in Kentucky, those two in Kentucky, those 11 in Pittsburgh, and so many other names who we don't know because of how swift the news cycle cycles. Amen. Tonight, as I said, we have 3 phenomenal leaders, 3 leaders who have been impactful in my life in a host of ways, as peers, as peer leaders, as peer teachers for me, and also my mentor who will share today. We have Reverend Levon, who will be with us, who will share with us. She'll share first. She's the founder of Beautiful Scars, which promotes healthy and safe conversations around religion, sex, and Blackness in order to address the silence in Black church on sexual violence. She graduated from Seton Hall University, Yale Divinity School, and Columbia Theological Seminary. At Columbia, she was able to publish her thesis, The Problem with Father God, Incest as a Silent Killer in the Black Church, which was an exploration of the practice of using poetry to preach about sexual violence from the pulpit. So we'll hear from Reverend Levon. Then we'll have Dr. Nichelle, who will share with us. Dr. Nichelle is the Dean of Sisters Chapel and the Director of the Wisdom Center at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. She's a graduate of Clark Atlanta University, of Yale Divinity School, and of Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, where she completed the Doctor of Philosophy in the area of liturgical studies with a concentration on homiletics. Her dissertation was entitled Towards a Womanist Homiletical Theology for Subverting Rape Culture. And so we're looking forward to hearing from Nichelle after we hear from Dr. Nichelle, after we hear from Reverend Levon. And then we'll hear from Dr. Simmons, who is the elder among us tonight. She is the founder of the Women of Color in Ministry Project. She's the principal of the critically acclaimed projects like the African American Lectionary and the African American Pulpit Journal, two homiletic and liturgical resources who have no peers, that are without peer. She's a co-editor of These Sisters Can Preach It, These Sisters Can Say It, Volume 2. She's also the author of Doing the Deed, The Mechanics of 21st Century Preaching, and one of the two general editors of Preaching with Sacred Fire, African American Sermons from 1750 to the present. I was also able to co-author a 21st Century Minister's Manual with Dr. Simmons that addresses many of the issues that we will wrestle with tonight, that your questions will prompt us to deal with tonight. Dr. Simmons is a writer, a preacher, and an attorney. And I believe she'll have on her attorney hat tonight. And if I'm not mistaken, I think all three of these sisters are members of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I don't think I've ever said that about Dr. Simmons out loud before, but I believe it is true. And if it's not, she'll correct us. So we're going to hear from these powerful leaders. And I'm gonna turn it over now to Reverend Levon.
Thank you so much, Willie, for this invitation. You and I have been conversation partners since our seminarian days when we would go back and forth on Twitter. And so you are a comrade. You have been in this with us. And so I'm so grateful to be here with Dr. Nichelle Guidry and Dr. Martha Simmons. So for me, I'm a preacher, I'm a poet, and I'm an educator. So I like to think that I have a way with words, and I know how important words are. They hold power to transform, power to heal, power to liberate. And we even talk about the word, right? Jesus as the word, the Logos, the one who was manifested in flesh. And there are so many stories that need to be manifested in the flesh, but are just kind of harboring in the spiritual purgatory. And so I consider myself to be a sort of midwife, if you will, a linguistic midwife who helps survivors in the Black church to name, own, and share their stories. Beautiful Scars is a boutique storytelling agency focused on trauma, healing, and resiliency. And the recent launch of the online platform is for Black Christian women who have experienced childhood sexual abuse and or male sexual violence, where we help survivors shift from silence to storytelling. Why? Because you can't talk about Black women and not talk about the Black church. And according to the Black Women's Blueprints, over 70% of Black women are sexually abused before they turn 18 years old. And I should probably back up and offer a trigger alert for sexual assault and just let viewers know that if you need to take a moment at any time to care for yourself, to please do so. And so with that kind of number, one can only inquire, well, how is this epidemic happening? And there's not a matching outcry for it, right? If 70% of the Black women that we knew just up and got the swine flu, we would want to know what was going on. Or maybe we wouldn't, because we don't really like Black girls and Black women that much in this country. And so we, as Black women leadership, have taken it upon ourselves to create protected, safe space for Black women. And what we've seen with the reemergence of the Me Too movement, originally founded by Tarana Burke in 2007, and gained some notoriety behind white Hollywood actresses last year, is that there's a radical reckoning happening in our society. And the church is not exempt from that reckoning, although it has been skating by, right? So according to Time's Up, about 201 perpetrators have been brought to justice and held accountable, and half of those men have been replaced by women. We're talking about politics, business, entertainment. I have not heard one story about the Me Too movement holding a male perpetrator in the Black church accountable. I have not heard one story about a predatory Black male pastor being replaced by a supremely talented and educated sister in the pulpit. And so I want to call the church to task to first hold its leadership accountable. When we look at the Black church, the beauty of it is, Baptism Sunday, the choir singing, pastor fanning him or herself, right, as we prepare for the next part of the service. But there's a seething epidemic happening underneath that is fostered and fueled by silence and stigma and shame. And so often we don't talk about sex in the Black church because we don't talk about sexuality. And we don't talk about sexuality because we don't talk about the body. And we don't talk about the body because for many of us, we can't even name our body parts. We don't even have agency in our own bodies. Black women's bodies have not been their own, whether you're looking at the history of chattel slavery, whether you're looking at the legacy of domestic ship and always having to create safe spaces for non-Black people. And now is a time for Black women to say, my body is my own. And what happens to my body is holy. What happens to my body is sacred. What happens to my body is an expression of religion. And so what I offer, through my thesis is to help preachers, Black preachers in particular, think through the ways that they posit sexual violence. It's not often that we hear those sermons preached, right? You have organizations like Sojourners who will do a national call and who will print 100 sermons that are focused on sexual violence. But every Black church is not doing that. And I do want to, take a step back and say, a lot of times we say the Black church isn't doing X, or the Black church never talks about Y, when there's really a critical mass of pastors, preachers, teachers, lay leaders who are actively engaging these very difficult conversations. And so the key is, if you are in a space where those conversations are not happening, whether it's a digital space like Twitter, Instagram Live, they are happening. So insert yourself in the conversation where you can. That being said, because the preaching moment is so central in the Black church, that is the prime opportunity for us to name male sexual violence. And it's important that we name it that, because according to Jackson Katz, a lot of times we talk about sexual violence against women as if it's some sort of random, isolated sort of creature that's just lurking around the alleyway, when no, by and large, it's men perpetrating violence against women. And so we have to call it male sexual violence very explicitly. And the way to do that is to deal with what, Phyllis Trimble calls a text of terror, which for me, there's no such thing as a taboo word. So I'm going to go there. It's, I feel called and I feel equipped to unpack a Judges 19 or, an Esther 1, where we talk about women having agency over themselves and their bodies and the trauma that is inflicted upon them. And so Beautiful Scars started as a blog in 2009. And I know She Preaches did too. I love how these blogs become ministries and then social enterprises. But ultimately, I was asking questions that I didn't always have answers for. And I think that I want to empower folks to realize that I don't know is a valid answer, and to realize that we have space and opportunity to do some really great, important work so that we can center the experiences of survivors. Because whether we like it or not, there are survivors in our congregations and there are perpetrators in our congregations. And there are perpetrators in our pulpits, right? And that deacon that hugs too long or too wrong, right? Like those are the aggressions, not microaggressions, because there's no such thing as a microaggression, according to Ebony Janice Moore. An aggression is an aggression that Black women are subjected to time after time in a space that is supposed to be healing and empowering. And so speaking of empowerment, what came out of my blog was a term called survivor, right? I didn't identify as a survivor, as one who suffered childhood sexual abuse and intimate partner violence. I felt like it made me sound like I was just limping along, like I was meandering through life. And I had community. I had 2 master's degrees, or I was working on the first one at the time. But I had been to therapy. I had become a runner, right? I was thriving. I was flourishing. And so this term survivor has become a movement for me where Black women who have been sexually abused, and I know that there are Black men who've been sexually abused too, but overwhelmingly it's Black women, can identify as survivor if and only if they are allowed and empowered to do the work to become a survivor. So what does that look like? We just had Purple Sunday on October 21st, and churches around the country partnered with us to pray, preach, shed light on, offer testimonies, provide resources and affirmation for survivors, not just the women who were abused, but also to the children who witnessed domestic violence in their homes, right? That's the thing about sexual violence. It's not just the survivors who are affected. It's a multi-generational traumatic syndrome that we have inherited and are perpetuating on each other, right? Like this understanding that we are supposed to be beaten, that that's the only way that you can fall in line, that Black men are, don't have power out in the world. So when they come home, they need to beat on their wife and children in order to feel masculine. These ideas around toxic masculinity that infect our theology, that infect how we show up in our churches, it has to be switched. And so one way to combat that is language. And I'm so committed to helping change the language in the Black church. Everything from something as small, no, it's not small, but something as helpful as gender inclusive language when we're talking about God, right? To realizing that there are no first person narratives in the Bible about sexual violence, but we have a wealth of poetry that talks about and names sexual violence. So how do we lift up poetry as a sacred text to walk alongside scripture so that we can then tell these stories from the pulpit, and not just preachers who are survivors themselves, but brothers who are not just allies, but what Michelle Kim calls a co-conspirator, someone who is actively deconstructing patriarchy and misogyny and misogynoir and lifting up women as equals, as important as loved by God. And so as I close, I want to be mindful of the power of the written and spoken word. And as Black church workers, we know that beyond the musical selections, the preaching moment is the primary opportunity for us to name that. And once pastors do that, their church then becomes a safe space for these conversations. And so I realized that 9 out of 10 pastors have an encounter with sexual violence in their congregations, and only 45% of them receive some sort of training in seminaries. So I do think, even as we're talking about the Black church, we need to think about how we're shaping leaders who are coming behind us, who are in seminary now or discerning seminary, so that we can start to have a more holistic conversation earlier on in our ministerial endeavors.
Thank you, Reverend Levon. If you have questions from Reverend Levon's presentation, I encourage you to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. At the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A tab. You can submit your questions there, and we'll make sure that each question, each comment gets addressed. Hopefully, we'll weed out the duplicates, and you'll feel heard, even if your exact question is not answered. But the spirit and the heart of your question is answered. So if you have questions, I ask you to populate those questions in the Q&A section. And I'm going to turn it over to Dean Michelle to give us.
Right, great. Thank you so much. Again, I want to echo Lavon's gratitude to you, Willie, and to the think tank for curating this space and this amazing conversation. It is a great discernment on your part that at this time in the narrative of this nation and the narrative of what God is doing in creation, that you should get God's people together at the wall to have a conversation about sexualized violence. So thank you. And deference to my co-panelists, Reverend Lavon, thank you for your brilliance and for your work. Reverend Dr. Martha Simmons, thank you for all that you have done. Anytime that I kind of start talking about sexual violence, I think that it's important to kind of define a couple of terms. And one of the terms that I always start with is rape culture. Because what we know about acts of violence, what we know about actual occurrences of the many different forms of assault is that many of them are preceded by other attitudes, myths, and behaviors that have already normalized the violence before the violence has already taken place. It's already normalized, and even in some senses has sanctioned violence and permitted it and said that it's okay. So rape culture is, and I often refer to my dissertation, I'm just going to be reading verbatim for some parts. So rape culture is the complex of widely shared attitudes, myths, and behaviors that normalize violence against women. And so in this sense, when we're talking about a culture, and we're talking about attitudes, myths, and behaviors, we're talking about how people think, how people behave, the kind of values and beliefs that shape how people and inform how people show up in the world. And so to me, it's not possible to talk about sexualized violence without talking about the normativity of misogyny, which is hatred against women. It's not possible to talk about sexualized violence without talking about patriarchy, which is the system and structure that privileges and empowers men over women simply on the basis of their gender. It's not possible to talk about sexualized violence without talking about heteronormativity, without talking about all of the different ways that certain bodies are privileged over others. And so I want to talk a little bit about what it means to live inside of a rape culture. We know that living inside of a rape culture means that our culture is so deeply informed and messages about the subordination of women are kind of, they're fed to us in a number of ways, right? So they're fed to us through our music, our film, all these different forms of media. They're fed to us in our church and our theologies, like Lavon said, something as subliminal as calling God Father, and these kind of androcentric terms by which we refer to the divine at the exclusion of the feminized language. It all sends a message. So helpful context or just background here is some scholarship that I find really, really helpful by a sociologist, anthropologist. Her name is Peggy Sanday. And in 1981, she published research on what she calls rape-prone societies. And so I just want to read a little bit about what Peggy Sanday writes about rape-prone societies. In rape-prone societies, she writes, rape incidence is high, rape is a ceremonial act, and rape is used to punish or threaten women. Rape-prone societies are identified by factors such as lower female power and authority, male expression of contempt for women as leaders and decision makers, high rates of interpersonal violence, and a high value of toughness and aggression as normal male attributes and characteristics. In rape-free societies, Women are valued and respected. Peggy Sanday concluded that men are not prone to rape on account of their biology, but are socialized to rape within a matrix of cultural forces, acceptable attitudes, and behaviors. And so what we see here in her scholarship is that before an act of violence even takes place, a society is already kind of riddled with these normative behaviors that strictly kind of differentiate along this gender binary of male and female, and also, again, privilege and empower men to kind of, in the words of President 45, do whatever they want to do, right? We know in 2016 that there was audio leaked where then presidential candidate 45 was actually recorded to say, I can do whatever I want to women. I can grab them by their private parts. I can grab them and kiss them. And, several months later, he went on to be elected president. And so what does it say about the society that we live in as rape prone, that a man can possess and embody and enflesh and exude these attitudes, these myths and these behaviors, and still rise to the highest office of the land? We have a lot of questions and some probing to do around that. In our society recently, in our culture recently, I know tonight's conversation is about sexual violence in church and society. And we've seen two extremely high profile illustrations of rape culture in church and society recently. And I just kind of want to take a little time to flesh out some of these ideas that I just gave in the context of these two really critical moments that we bore witness to. So in the church recently, the homegoing of Aretha Franklin was a hot mess for so many reasons. But for those of us who were Black women who were watching with a critical eye, many of us, while offering commentary, both live and thereafter, so many of us kind of walked away with the whole attitude of, but I'm not surprised, right? The only thing that did is it flipped the lid on attitudes, myths, and behaviors that have been taking place in churches, Black or otherwise, for, God knows how long. And so when you had this moment, this kind of watershed moment, this outcry that occurred when the presiding bishop when he just groped Ariana Grande, right? We saw his, from the second that he and her converged on that pulpit, there really wasn't a reason why he had to put his arm around her in the first place. And then there wasn't a reason why that he had to keep his arm around her. And then there wasn't a reason why his hands, invaded her personal private parts on her flesh, her body, the way that they did. But then there wasn't, the outcry was not primarily, why did this happen? But it was, why did she dress that way for the funeral in the first place?
Exactly.
And so what we have here is an example of an act of violence that was committed. But even before the act of violence was committed, what did you see, right? What did we see? We saw the pulpit proliferated with male figures at the Queen of Souls funeral, right? There might have been one, I think Shirley Caesar was up there, maybe one other woman, but none were known feminists, none were known womanists, right? Or espouse feminist or womanist liberative principles. We saw women that might have come to the pulpit to say a word and then exit. We primarily saw women singing. The most prominent role as presider did not even happen, or to the point that Levon made, as eulogists were not by women, right? And so what we saw in that moment was an act of violence that had already been preceded by a perfect storm for that act of violence to occur, right? And then the aftermath of it, right? I think, again, the critique of her attire and the critique of why she was there in the first place. And then the sermon. I mean, I'm gonna let LaVon talk about how bad that sermon was and how misogynistic the sermon was, how anti-Black the sermon was. But again, what we saw in that funeral and in that moment was how an act of violence is already preceded by showings of power and the normalization of the dehumanization of women. Okay? The second moment that I want to kind of discuss very briefly is Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's recent Supreme Court testimony. It was said leading up to it that Dr. Ford, and God bless her for the decision that she made to testify before the world. And God bless Anita Hill, her predecessor in that heavy lifting, Black woman, because women everywhere, survivors of any form of assault, knew that what both of these women signed up to do was simply magnanimous. Knowing the kind of culture, right? The same court that went ahead and elected Clarence Thomas also went ahead and elected Kavanaugh, right? After this, these women put their lives on the line to bare their souls, to tell their stories. She sat through, and many of us watched, some of us didn't watch, almost a full day of scrutiny. Details from her story, details from her memory, her story, her testimony, and the way that there was so much response, both inside of that space and inside of our culture, critique of her own story, right? The blaming, this idea of how women somehow bring rape on themselves, this victim blaming. We saw again that we have a culture that will take a woman's story, take a woman's body, completely undermine all of it. And because it already has its, they already knew, I believe, they already knew what was going to happen with Brett Kavanaugh. That's why at the end of the day, they want to give us, this kind of, piss poor 5-day investigation to make it look like, but he still was sworn in, right? And we have a new Supreme Court justice who's a known, alleged rapist at this point, right? Another one. And so we have, in so many ways, normalized violence by normalizing patriarchy, by normalizing misogyny, by telling perpetrators and electing perpetrators, by telling them that you can do all of that and still obtain these high offices of power, prestige, and leadership, right? And the same goes in our churches. I mean, I think about the various forms of harassment and the various forms of assault that I have personally experienced. And as a woman who has intentionally positioned myself as an advocate to women in ministry, the stories that I have heard that substantiate the claim that the same attitudes and myths and behaviors that operate in society, right, also operate in the church. I think that LaVon's work around resourcing is really, really critical, resourcing specifically to survivors. Because when you live inside of a culture that is inundated in violence, when you live inside of a patriarchal culture, when you live and you move and you work inside of systems that operate inside of these ideological forms, there also has to be consideration for how the whole system is going to be addressed. And so I think LaVon's work on storytelling and resourcing is incredibly important. But I think as we have these conversations, we also need to be thinking about how are we going to address the people who perpetrate? How are we going to address the people who are complicit? How are we going to address the people who, how are we going to address the structures that have patriarchal values embedded within them? How are we going to address all of it, right? Because in both of these scenarios and in all scenarios, there's not just men who are complicit. There's also women who are complicit. There is a problem inside of this rape culture with women not believing women, with women still voting for 45, with women still voting for Kavanaugh, with women standing behind their creepy pastors, you know. And so we have so many different layers inside of this culture. We have so many different layers inside of these societies, these rape-prone societies, right? We have to address attitudes. We have to address the myth of women being more emotional than men. Because if there's one takeaway that we can take away from that hearing that day, it's that men are actually quite emotional to the point of losing their minds. And Dr. Ford withstood all of those hours of scrutiny. Brett Kavanaugh couldn't even make it, right? Like, and so how do we deconstruct? How do we indict these systems, and also call into account all of us, you know, even the woke ones, for how we have been complicit? I think I can stop there, because I think one of the things that I definitely want to hear Dr. Simmons, and I want to get into the nuts and bolts of the conversation, but I want us to understand that when we talk about sexual violence, we also need to talk about how acts of violence are precipitated by the normalization of attitudes, myths, and behaviors that dehumanize women.
Thank you, Dr. Nichelle. We've heard from Dr. Nichelle. We've heard from Reverend LaVon. Now we'll hear from Dr. Simmons.
I want to say good evening and thank you to the Black Think Tank and to Dr. Coates and Reverend Francois for this opportunity. And I am particularly pleased to be here with Reverend LaVon, Dr. Guidry, and Reverend Francois. These are some of the most important voices of our day. And so I'm glad I just get to hang out with them. So glad about that. I think the approach that I want to take in terms of what I want to address is to go a little bit toward legally talking about this, because typically when you bring this up, you bring up the subject of rape, the subject of sexual harassment, sexual assault. People are immediately want to know, well, what does it mean for the church legally? In other words, what kind of trouble can we get in? They're not so much concerned about what is being done to women and how women are being debased and harmed, but they are concerned about what legal trouble can they get in. So I just want to talk a bit about pastors who won't care at all about any of this discussion, but they do care about being in legal trouble. For those who are heads of churches who really don't care about women, but they do care about their church having to pay out money for acts that could have stopped. So I'm just going to go there. I'm going to go there where it tends to bother us, where it tends to hurt us. So I'm going to begin with, and I'm going to do some reading back and forth because some of this is legal language. And I wasn't about to try to remember all of it for my work over the years in working with women around issues of sexual harassment and rape. Sexual harassment, and this is the federal government definition. Sexual harassment, according to the federal government, is a form of sex discrimination prohibited by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It consists of both quid pro quo harassment and hostile environment harassment. Religious organizations that are subject to Title VII are covered by this prohibition. An employer, meaning a pastor, is automatically liable for supervisory employees' acts of harassment, but a defense is available to claims of hostile environment harassment if the institution has adopted a written harassment policy and an alleged victim fails to pursue remedies first under the policy. Okay. Title VII only applies to employers that have 15 or more employees, and number 2, are engaged in interstate commerce. Accordingly, it does not apply to most churches, but it does apply to many denominational agencies, all of which are engaged in interstate commerce. Nevertheless, many state and federal courts have permitted women to file sexual harassment lawsuits, even though their employers are not subject to Title VII. Okay. Harassment on the basis of sex is a violation of Section 703 of Title VII. Now, what does that mean? It means that any unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature constitutes sexual harassment. Number 1, when submission to such conduct is made either explicit or implicit as a term or condition of an individual's employment. Number 2, submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as the basis for employment. Okay. Sexual harassment, as I said, it includes quid pro quo harassment, which refers to conditions of employment, and hostile environment employment. I want us to remember though. Then there's the matter of liability under state law, and this is what gets most churches. Okay, it's usually going to be state law because so many churches are not liable under Title VII. Okay, and so the issue becomes under state law, was it voluntary? You know, we're the first ones in the church to say, well, were they in a relationship? Did she act in a certain way to cause it to happen? Those kinds of things. And I think this is going to surprise some churches. The Supreme Court, in responding to this question, was it voluntary, has observed the fact that sex-related conduct was voluntary in the sense that the complainant was not forced to participate against her will is not always a defense. It's not always a defense to a sexual harassment suit. The issue of any sexual harassment claim is that the alleged sexual advances were unwelcome. The correct inquiry is whether the victim, by her conduct, indicated that the alleged sexual advances were unwelcome. Okay, and any kind of way they were unwelcome, and not whether her sexual participation in sexual intercourse was voluntary. Because in so many instances, what people call voluntary is not voluntary, because there are people afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of losing their livelihood, afraid of not giving out of PhD programs, afraid of not getting ordained. Okay. So that's not voluntary. So I want to really make that clear. Let me say a little bit more about church liability. Is a church or other employer liable for acts of sexual harassment considered by its workers? According to EEOC, the answer is a definite yes. So for all of those churches out there who think that it's just a personal thing, we can kind of sweep to the side, we'll pray about it. No, you are liable. You can be sued and people can go to jail. Be real clear about that. An employer is responsible for its acts and those of its agents and supervisory employees with respect to sexual harassment, regardless of whether the specific acts complained of were authorized or even forbidden by the employer. So it's not enough to say that I told them not to do it. If you didn't put in place any guardrails to stop it, you are still responsible. It's not enough to just say everybody knew how I felt about it. You have to put some guardrails in place to stop it, or you are likely to be held liable. An employer can also be responsible, and this one often gets churches. An employer can also be responsible for the acts of non-employees with respect to sexual harassment of employees in the workplace. And most often, this means volunteers. This means people who volunteer at the church. They're not being paid by the church, but the church allowed them to volunteer. If the church knows or should have known of their conduct and failed to do anything about it or to take appropriate immediate corrective action, the church can be held liable. Okay. Now, I know that was a lot to take in, but I simply want to say to churches, it is a new day. I know you all think it's not a new day, but I want to help you really know it's a new day. You will be sued. You will pay out some money. Some people will go to jail. And if it's bad enough, you could lose so much because you've not taken any steps to say, this is how we feel about sexual harassment, about rape culture, about how women are supposed to be treated. It's not enough for individual pastors, especially senior pastors, or even denominational officials to say, well, we talked about it. That's not enough. You've got to put some guardrails in place. And I'm telling pastors more and more, begin with your own personal guardrails. No, you don't need to hug everybody. No, you don't need to get up in church and comment on a woman's clothes, her hats, her shoes, her this or that. Don't do it. Correct yourself first. You begin the guardrails, and then you can help build a culture in your church so that everyone knows that women are to be honored in your church and that women are to be believed. Because that's the other mistake that churches make. Women will come to a board and say, this happened to me. And instead of believing the woman, they will dog the woman out. They will reassault or re-rape the woman all over again. And I want the churches to know you will pay for that too. You will pay for that too. So if you don't know how to talk to survivors, if you don't know how to talk to people who've been harassed and assaulted, you better go bring in somebody who does know how to do it. You better let the deacons, the trustees, the elders, and everybody know what today is. This, like I said, this is a real moment, and things have changed. They may not have changed certainly as quickly as we want them to, but they have changed, and more women are standing up and saying, oh no, You will not get away with that. I may have cried and moaned about it for a moment, but after that, I'm going to get up and let the world know what you did and that you need to be stopped. And I just want to say to churches, now is the time to put your guardrails in place. And I was really thinking through this, Reverend Francois, as we were doing the manual. And I was talking to so many women who work with wonderful programs around this country. How few guardrails churches actually have in place. It's not in their constitutions. It's not in their bylaws. It's not even written anywhere. They just assume, we know what to do. That's ridiculous. That's absurd. And that's why you can be sued when something goes wrong. So whether it's your youth department, whether it's the senior pastor, the children's department, whatever it is, put the guardrails in place and do it now. It's better to pay for people to help you do that, pay that small amount of money, than pay the large amount plus cost the church in losing who it really should be in terms of protecting women and giving a home to women, being a safe place for women. When you don't put the guardrails in place, you are also hurting the church and what the church should be about as a safety net, as a safe place for women. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons. Thank you, Reverend Levon. Thank you, Dr. Nichelle, for great contribution for getting this conversation started. And now I want to pivot to the audience. We have some questions that have been populated, some questions that have been provided. I want to remind the viewers that if you have questions, whether via Facebook Live now, you can submit questions there. And if you're actually on the Zoom platform, you can submit questions in the Q&A section. Also, if you want to become a part of the BCC community and be current on our actions, our plans of action, I submitted a link in the chat box, and you can click on that link and plug in your information, and we'll make sure that you stay current with what we're doing. Again, I want to thank you three for leading us in such a transformatively raw conversation. So I want to thank you for the honesty and the truth telling, which I think is the best of Black church traditions. I think you all did that tonight, giving us that raw truth telling. I want to ask a question, just in terms of the touchstones. Are there some touchstones of creating safe and brave space? Dr. Simmons was really helping us think deeply about guardrails that are necessary to create safe space, accountable space. But I do, hope that we can think deeply, get us some more targeted ideas on what it means to create safe and brave space. One thing I've always appreciated about Black feminist and womanist ethics frameworks is that alongside of deconstructing patriarchy and whiteness, alongside heterosexism and classism and a host of other oppressive logics and structures, I've always appreciated that Black feminist ethics and womanist ethics dares to forecast an emancipatory future while naming the very real problems that exist, the oppressive problems that exist. There's also a part of that framework is the capacity to name a future, to name the kingdom of God, the reign of God in some powerful ways. And I'm saying that safe and brave space, I would like to believe, are part of what that beloved community, that kingdom of God looks like. So can you guys help us think about some touchstones for creating safe and brave space?
I think one of the touchstones is allowing women to lead at every age and every stage. Every age and every stage. You can't break the grip of patriarchy until you start to do it at an early age. I remember when I knew I had been called to preach, and I didn't know any women preachers. And I think I was 11 or 12 at the time. So I said to this deacon, because it had dawned on me, I'd seen many deacons who had become preachers. So I said to this deacon, I want to be a deacon in training, because I thought that that was the roadmap that I needed to use. Well, of course, he patted me on my head as if I was out of my mind. And I remember that because I thought to myself, why aren't there any women who are deacons back at that time? And often there aren't any today. So for me, one of the touchstones would be allowing women to lead at every age and at every stage. And also, and I know that there are women who participate in the patriarchy. But I think the reason so many participate and are caught up by it is because no one ever taught them or told them, you don't have to lead like a man. You don't have to do anything like a man. You can do it as you. And so they never learned it. They didn't see any women in positions in their formative years. So for me, that would be one of the first ones. Start in all of our churches, letting women lead at every stage and formation of their faith, whether they are in the junior choir, the junior ushers, the deacon boards, and etc. Let women lead so that they will be able to grasp who they are as leaders, and they will be able to then say what should and shouldn't happen in the space they call church.
Thank you, Doc. Reverend Levon, Dr. Nichelle.
I'd like to just read from the creator of the whole concept and movement called Brave Space. Her name is Mickey Scott B. Jones. She's out in Tennessee. And she's the brilliance and the brains behind Brave Space. And this is how she articulates what Brave Space is. An invitation to Brave Space. Together we will create Brave Space, because there's no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together. And we will work on it side by side. By Mickey Scott B. Jones, who is a Black woman. And the power that I believe it is implicit in what she's laid out in Brave Spaces is that it equalizes the power, the differences in power and the different levels of power. She's actually also kind of subverting traditional power structures by amplifying the voices that seek to be heard elsewhere. And other, all these other different ways that she's really subverting these traditional norms of what have come to be very contentious spaces. And so I think one of the things that we can do to start to create brave spaces is having conversations like this to kind of make to make the people in our communities and our congregations more aware of these cultures and these stratifications, and to be able to locate the players within those stratifications and to locate themselves. I think to Dr. Simmons's point, a lot of women haven't been able to raise their voices against patriarchy because they don't even have the language of patriarchy, right? And to be, or the framework to identify that we're all moving and being acculturated inside of patriarchy. And so subverting those positions, bringing the women into the center, bringing the queer folks into the center, hearing the voices, the perspectives, the experiences, and the stories of the people who, of those people, and taking our cues from their lived experiences. So many of us have lived out narratives and tried to live out narratives inside of communities where the norm is a male experience. And what do you do when that's just not yours? You succumb to this marginalized identity. And I see this, and God, a perfect example is the rape culture that is the Atlanta University Center, right? We just came off of Spellhouse Homecoming. And I have spoken to a number of my students at Spelman who experienced various forms of assault, but don't feel empowered to report because Title IX doesn't do anything, right? And so you have in these spaces people who might be aware that something is wrong, but feel completely disempowered even though resources are there. And maybe the resources aren't the best, right? And I think that's when we have to step up to our community. We have to identify ourselves. I think being brave requires courage. And I know that I can speak for I can speak for the women on this panel. I can speak for so many women in this field that we have had to be very strong and courageous, as Yahweh told, Joshua, be very strong and courageous, because when you take on evil, it requires that. And so I think there's this kind of political work that has to be done and this theological work, but I'm also really interested in what is the spirituality of resistance that sustains people who survive and people who call out. How do we not die in the course of this work, right? And how do we preserve the lives of the people that we want to cape for? I do think that there are so many powerful resources that are available to us. I want to call out just a couple of organizations and also initiatives. The Reformation Project is a wonderful organization that does work around the full inclusion of LGBTQIA folks in the church. And they provide conferences, webinars, and trainings that will sensitize us with language, will sensitize us with tools for creating these kinds of safe and brave spaces. I think Levon's work is also really powerful, and so many others. I wish I would have written them down. But I think in so doing, my hope is that if we find that our leaders and our churches are just insufficient as they are, that we will identify and even take on the courage to become the other models, to become the other way. The gospel is not going to, if the gospel is not going to die out, right? With these antiquated models of leadership and doing church, then those of us who believe that the gospel is still a key to liberation and a key to healing have got to take on our courage and have got to start establishing and living out other models by which to live. In the words of Carrie Mae Weems, this is an artist photographer who's really informing my ministry right now. And so what does it mean to look outside of the church for a cue of what the church can be? To look outside of preachers for a cue as to what preaching can be. And if the liberation is happening in other spaces, learning, how is that happening and what does it take? And partnering. Sometimes we got to get outside of our four walls. I know many of us are so wedded to our churches, and that's a powerful thing in the Black community. But it would behoove us in this moment to begin to learn and to take cues and to receive guidance from the work that's being done outside of the church.
Okay. Yeah.
So I am a practical theologian, so I'm all about praxis. One thing that I challenge churches to do is to use the anatomically correct terms for body parts. You do not have a PP, you have a penis. You do not have a hoo-ha, you have a vagina, right? Like, let's take away any kind of stigma around just naming what God created to be good. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, when we're creating these brave spaces, we also have to create a culture of belief. I'm always astonished when I meet Christians who can believe that a rod split a body of water in two so that folks could escape to the other side and then it enclosed and camp their enemies. But when a woman says, the deacon molested me, when a woman says, my uncle raped me, somehow you can't believe that. Or you do, but maybe you don't have the strength to, one, face your own trauma, or two, you don't know how to address the situation. And so whenever someone comes forward with a story of sexual assault, because less than 2% of folks who come forward are lying, so that means 98% of people are telling the truth. The first thing is to say, I hear you, I see you, I believe you, right? I acknowledge you. That shows that the space is being created for this person. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Again, that reifies your belief, and it also shows some sort of remorse, because a lot of times what survivors need to hear is that somebody is angry that this happened, which leads me to my last point, which it's not your fault, and God is pissed that this happened to you. Like, we can't leave out any part of this person's personhood, and that includes God's rage against this. And so for me, in creating brave space, because it focuses on language, it's using proper terms for body parts and having the correct language to address folks when they come forward.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question here that is coming. It's for Dr. Simmons. So glad that person said, so glad you're going there. I wish you would have a legal session at every Black denomination's national conference. Having policy on sexual harassment and misconduct is only the beginning. So that's a statement for you and a suggestion for you, Dr. Simmons. Dr. Guidry, I remember your dissertation. When will your book come out? We want to hear that. Also, why is this conversation mostly women's work theologically? Why are our Black theologians so silent on sexual harassment, besides the fact that some of them are perpetrators?
That's a great question. And in answer to the first question, the dissertation will be a book. I'm currently in the process of turning it into preparing a book proposal. I have several publishers that have already expressed interest in it, so it's in the works.
All right.
If the saints pray, that'll come through down the pipe.
Right.
But before the book, what I really hope to be able to do with some of the research and some of also the work that's happened since I finished writing is creating workshops that will be able to teach emancipatory preaching, anti-rape culture preaching, which is what I wrote about in dissertation. The question was, why does it seem like the work of subverting rape culture, addressing sexualized violence theologically is women's work? I wish I had the full answer to that question. And I don't want to make the claim that our male colleagues and predecessors in the field didn't address it because they were perpetrators. I don't know. So I don't want to speak on that. It's possible, but I don't know. But I think part of the reason why it's women's work is probably in correlation with some of the statistics that say that women are overwhelmingly the victims.
Exactly.
Of sexualized violence. Right. I think that, many of us received our call, and many of us who do this work on sexualized violence work through that by doing this work. I hate to say that, but many of our calls come as a result of our greatest traumas. And doing the work is a part of the process of healing. I can't say that for every other woman who's written about this, but I know that I have had trouble conceptualizing of ministry being done, my ministry outside of a womanist center, because womanism has given me the tools to be able to heal and do my work at the same time. And so I think to me, that's probably a basic answer. Women take this work up because women bear the brunt of rape culture.
That's right.
And doing this work as an act of resistance, right? And I write about this in my dissertation, how this is a burden. It is a burden to have to live within rape culture and have to survive it, or in LaVon's words, to thrive within it, and to be the one who casts a vision of another way. That's tiring, and that's burdensome. But do you think the same population that's perpetrating the crimes are going to do that work?
Right.
And so I think that's why.
Thank you so much. We have a question here, a comment and a question. I think it's open for any of our panelists to address. Black women are the heart and soul and strength of the Black church. Black women should make demands upon the Black church to sufficiently address sexual violence in the Black church. And if it doesn't happen, Black women should leave those problematic congregations in large numbers. How do we empower Black women in that way? Should there be a national movement like that so Black women don't feel alone in taking that stand? Only when there are consequences like that, Black women leaving congregations in noticeable numbers, do I believe that we will substantively move the Black church to do better.
First of all, I just have to say that was a lot of shoulding, really. I mean, and I just have to put it out there that, when people want to come with prescriptives, I think we also need to be able to come with some solutions. And I think to be able to say what Black women should do,
right,
is quite a privilege. And it's very interesting to think about how, Black women are intersectional beings, right? And, in as much as a church might be a source of the trauma or a part of the problem, a part of the trauma, for many of us, our churches are still our sanctuaries, and the place where you go to get a weekly dose of divine perspective. And so, as much as I would love to be able to say, let's organize a national walkout, I also understand that to some women, walking out and missing that word might mean the difference between life and death for her. That's how I believe church is in the DNA of so many Black people, Black women included. And that's why you can see so many women work inside of these spaces, you know, knowing good and well that there's a part of their humanity that they have to leave at the door, or knowing good and well that when I walk into the church, the XYZ might happen. But when I walk into the church, let me tell you what might also happen for me. I'm gonna meet God, or I'm gonna hear something that's gonna help me to see things in a way that I couldn't see it without this, or I'm gonna receive a hug. You know, and not every hug is a holy hug, but there are some that are holy and healing. And I might not be able to get that anywhere but my church. And so we got to deal with the tensions that live inside of our church. We got to deal with the fact that our churches are intrinsically paradoxical spaces where the both and can occur in the same breath. And we can't underestimate or overestimate what you're really asking a woman to do when you're asking her to leave her church. What you're asking a woman to do when you're asking her to leave her church.
I agree certainly with that. I think the other thing when you talk about people leaving is that I think that there are women who are ready to leave, but they don't have any leaving language, first of all, and they don't know where they're going. And so it's even scarier to walk out into nowhere for some. But I do believe that those who do this work, those who write about the subjects, have to begin to help women to know that they should not have to sacrifice so much of themselves just to be in a church. Because I think if you sacrifice too much of your humanity to a church, you become so much less than what God created you to be. So I think we need ways to not only understand what the church can help women do, but we also need ways to help women stand up and say, no, you cannot take this level of my humanity and I will not stay. And when I leave, I'm going with God. And I'm going to be okay without this particular type church that refused to respect my humanity. So I think more and more women are leaving. They are leaving these churches. Nobody's writing about it or talking about it, but I'm hearing about it constantly. So many churches they'll say we have no idea what happened, but sisters are gone. They are gone. And so I think we need more ways to help women talk about whether they're going to leave or stay, the language to maintain their humanity and to be empowered and to know that wherever you go, you can go with God.
So when a woman is in a domestic violence situation, people who don't know anything about power always say, well, just leave. Mm-hmm. And it's not that simple. A lot of times victims have been isolated from family, friends. They don't have their own finances. Right. I've heard practitioners say to literally park your car with the hood facing outward. So if you need to escape, you can get out quickly. Like, right. People don't think that practically in terms of these things. So in the church, for many Black women, where the church is this abusive lover at times, where it started out beautifully. You came to Jesus, you had your moment, and now you just want to serve God and love on God's people. But then slowly but surely the abuse comes in. And what does an abuser do? But say, I'm sorry, baby, it won't happen again. I'm sorry, daughter, it won't happen again. But then it does. happen repeatedly. And so it's not that easy to tell women to just leave the Black church when Black churches are 85% Black women. But what it does mean is for those of us who did get out, and I mean out of an abusive relationship with the church, not necessarily leaving the church, that we create these spaces, right?
Exactly.
Dr. Guidry was talking about what is church, what is preaching, what do those things look like outside of the four walls? Does it mean having a brunch, having a house church, having an Instagram live, doing Zoom calls with live, right? We have to create those spaces outside of the church before we can tell people to just flee. Where are they going to seek refuge? Where else are they going to meet God? And to realize that there are those of us who are called and equipped and strong enough to stay inside the church to subvert the paradigm there. Like we've been saying, this is a multi-layered issue. And so we need to attack it, right? From all these different points.
Right.
To your point, Yvonne, I just want to lift up a couple of people and places that are doing some really, really powerful things. And I don't know if y'all have ever like logged on for Dr. Melva Sampson's Pink Road Chronicles, but Dr. Melva is like, she is so lit, and it's on Sunday mornings, and you cannot tell me that spirit does not be moving when she opens up her mouth. Dr. Melva Sampson is doing great, amazing things. Dr. Ireland Session has a womanist gathering that she has convened in Dallas, and I hope that I get a chance to go and bear witness to that someday. But from what I see online and from Dr. Irie's reflections of her ministry, they have really curated a womanist gathering that is safe and empowering to Black women. I know Dr. Gina Stewart is a pastor in a traditional sense, but when I attended her church, what I witnessed at Dr. Gina Stewart's church was a woman who has ascended the ranks of her church to become the senior pastor and has and takes the work of molding and mentoring and investing in younger women who are pursuing that role very seriously. She takes it so seriously. And you can see even how her encouragement of younger preachers, particularly those who are in her church, Christ Missionary Baptist, it transcends the church into how she kind of advocates for us in digital spaces. And so, I remember going to her church and being like, man, this is the red tent, man. We up in here getting empowered. We loving on each other as women. We preaching the word. We meeting with God. And it was just almost like the congregation just gazed in as it was happening. I've never experienced a church like that. That was amazing. And so in thinking about the range of ways that Black women are addressing these issues, whether they mean to or not. You know, I think a long time ago, we tapped into the need that we needed to do something different. And, with these different technologies and modalities these days, come on, like LaVon said, brunch. There have been many Sundays since I haven't worked in a church that I have communed with the Spirit and with sister friends and with family over some mimosas and some waffles, okay? Amen, thank you, God. And, and found that to be nourishing. Absolutely nourishing. Absolutely. And so, again, I really want to lift up, if the models as we have seen have been insufficient, we can do the work of becoming other models by which to live. And I want to send you a link to that work, Reverend Francois, to share with the people who are on this webinar, because that has really just opened up my mind to thinking about, what is required of other models by which to live? What is required of other models by which to do ministry if the ones we have aren't good enough? Or we're good enough for something, but not for something else, we can do that.
Reverend Francois, in terms of also resources, I want to recommend the Christian Minister's Manual. And yes, I'm one of the co-authors along with Reverend Francois. But in there, we list, I think, about 20 entities that deal with rape culture and sexual violence from the practical level all the way down to church, because often women just need someone at the other end of the line who can, when they say, this is what happened, what do I do? There are actually organizations out there, Black, white, Latino, all kinds of organizations out there, women for organizations for LGBTQ women, just all kinds that are out there, and we list them in that minister's manual. We also list some of the guardrails that churches need to do something about sexual harassment, about rape, about just the harm that comes to women. And I also think, just in terms of resources, more and more men are starting to try to figure out ways to have the conversation. And so, Reverend Francois, I want to encourage you and brothers like you to start to have the conversation with men. I know why it's mainly women doing this work, but it shouldn't be just women doing this work. And there are a few entities that are online, and I'm having a brain freeze right now, but there are a couple online that deal with sexual harassment, rape, patriarchy, etc., that are basically male groups. And I can send those to you so that you can post those online, because it's really time for brothers to get involved and start to talk so that they get the language, they can come to understand what they need to do to help just stop some of this craziness, this pain, and this ridiculousness.
I second that, and I actually think that if there's any thought or consideration given to a follow-up webinar, that you might want to think about getting a panel of brothers together to have this same conversation about complicity and allyship and their place in this problem and their place in the solutions.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I want to respect the time of the viewers and definitely the panelists. One thing that I've been interested in, and I'm grateful for Lavon's language today of what it means to be a co-conspirator in deconstructing patriarchy, which is a daily, ongoing, never-ending practice for men. We never overcome male privilege, nor do we ever overcome the blind spots of patriarchy, which is why I've always wondered what we in churches, the Black Church Center, we host these racial equity conversations in interracial settings, and I've always wondered what it would look like to have an anti-patriarchy training just for men, and I don't know what the configuration looks like in terms of facilities, but I always wonder what that would look like, because that is still one of our original, maybe the original sin of the Black church is patriarchy. This sort of
it is.
I'll say.
We just lost our beloved Ntozake Shange, and she said, "My spirit is too ancient to understand the separation of soul and gender. It's impossible." So we have to talk about gender if we're talking about God.
Yeah. Okay. There's one more question we're going to leave on this one note. Anybody can jump at it if you want, and then after that, we'll wrap up tonight. I want to thank you guys again for such a thorough treatment of the subject. Thank you for just the brilliance that you bring to ministry, and the truth telling, the courageous truth telling that you bring to the world. It is constructively challenging for me, and which I deeply appreciate. Checking my blind spots, checking my privilege. So I appreciate how you guys push me on that. We have a question here, and this is our final question, really about what it means to reimagine spaces, reimagine Black sacred spaces. The caller says that as we think of Audre Lorde's "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," is a reconfiguration of existing Black sacred spaces by making more space for women's leadership, etc., just a tool of the house that won't deconstruct the actual house of rape culture. If so, then can we envision what a new Black sacred space, i.e. a new Black church, looks like that is built from the ground up versus remodeling a foundationally flawed model?
I feel like what I love about this question is that it's turning our face to the future. And I do think that if we think about what we mean by sacred space, I think that Black women have been creating, curating, and taking up sacred space since the dawn of time. Sacred space for Black women happens when we're on the phone with our best friend in California. Sacred space happens when we're getting our hair done after some traumatic event and the water makes you cry. Sacred space happens when you decide to go sleep when you need sleep. Sacred space happens when we decide that we love ourselves and we decide to give ourselves what we need to be whole and to flourish. And it happens when we decide that we're not going to depend on any intermediary to get to God. And we're going to look to what we have in our possession, in our own well of resources to get to God, primarily through our relationships with each other. I talk about sisterhood a lot. And I have conceptualized that my sisterhoods are my church. My relationships with women, the ones that have been life-giving, the few that have been life-giving. Those are my sacred space, because those are the spaces where I can take my needs and my concerns and my frustrations and my imperfections. I can take my mask off. I don't have to precede myself with my titles and my designations. I can just be myself and know that there's love in those spaces. And where that is, there is God. And so I think our challenge as we're thinking about the future is to really broaden and define for ourselves what we mean by sacred space. Is it a space that I have to open a door and walk into? Or is it a place I can turn inward and tap into it? And so I think Black women have to take up our agency to decide for ourselves, individually and collectively, what we are looking for and what we mean when we say sacred space.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think a Black woman's body is sacred space. A Black woman's body is a site of sacred space. And if we can just internalize that concept, then we won't have to allow Black women to lead. We will follow their leading. I mean, from the governor's mansion to the pulpit, let Black women lead. We have been for millennia resourceful and resilient and divinely connected to the Holy Spirit and getting spiritual downloads. We know what to do, right, but we need to be followed. And so even as we're talking about God as El Shaddai, the double-breasted one, what would it look like to resist millennia of man-centered talk about God with woman-centered talk? Mm-hmm. Or no gender at all. God as designer, God as creator, God as caregiver, right? To challenge ourselves to talk about God in life-giving ways. Anytime you do that, I believe you're creating sacred space. And to not just put any old Black woman in charge, right? One who has checked her white supremacy, one who has dealt with her internalized oppression, one who has dealt with her homophobia and her transphobia, right? Not just to say she's there because there was a woman at the Supreme Court hearing, who is just there taking up space. We don't want folks who are taking up space. We want folks who are helping to create more protected, sacred space.
Right. I think ultimately, Reverend Francois, if you talk about what we're going to do to change the church and whether or not we're doing it with the master's tools, I don't think the Black church has ever just belonged to Black men. And I don't think it ever will. And so I think, as Dr. Guidry said, we get to decide what Black sacred space is for us and how we want to live in that space and how we want that space treated. And then I think we can start to look at some new models, some guardrails, all of those kinds of things. When women decide to say, this is what a safe space is for me. Here's how I act in one. Here's how people will treat me in one. And here's how the space is designed. Here's what it consists of. Like I said earlier, we don't even have language in Constitution, bylaws. We don't talk about it in our Sunday school material. Nowhere do we get the language to prevent sexual assault and rape culture. We don't even have the language. So if you want to start to turn around, if you want to start to end patriarchy, first you need the language and the resolve to do that. And so I think it'll go a long way if we would start to give the church just some language to say, here's how we fight, here's how we create safe space, and that every sister gets to decide for herself what's a safe space.
Thank you so much. I know we can't hear the audience, but they are clapping and amen all the way through this. Thank you, Dr. Simmons. Thank you, Dr. Deshelle. Thank you, Reverend Levon, for all that you are. And I truly appreciate what you contributed tonight. This has been the Black Church Agenda, Sexual Violence in Church and Society, hosted by the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality. If you want to connect with us in the chat box, you can hit that link and key in your information, and you'll get everything we ever push out. I'm looking forward to after the election. Let's go. We have to vote on November 6th. We have to vote on November 6th, especially in Georgia. Y'all really got to do that work in Georgia.
We're doing it. We're doing that work. We are doing the work.
No, it's right.
We are doing it. We are doing it.
Post-election, we'll have another Black Church Agenda where we'll be prepping for a Black Church legislative agenda, come up with some Black church legislative priorities for the next 2 years, next 4 years, next 6 years, so that we can create the type of emancipatory world, abolitionist world that we deserve and that America claims to be, but has yet to actually be. So thank you, everyone. Sorry for the 10 minutes of overtime that you gave us, but with panelists like this, you cannot cut them off. You miss too much. You all have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.